guys. And thank you guys all for signing up, for being here, for jumping into this discussion on Cabernet. And thank you to Carlton so much for spending some time with us, for doing this with us, and for educating all of us on what you're going to be educating us on, which is the world of Napa Cab and everything in between. And we're all going to walk out of here wine professionals and amazing MSs, right?
If I work hard enough, I'll be a wine professional one day.
Well,
The professional part I haven't gotten down yet.
Thank you. If you guys, hopefully, if you have or you haven't, there's a little sheet there that was sent over to you. If you wanted to print it out, take some notes, please do. And hopefully, I know some of you, this heat's brutal. Some of you had some wines that leaked a little bit on the way over. If anything was compromised or doesn't show well in this tasting today, let me know, and we'll get you a replacement bottle. And I apologize for that. It's just, trying to work around this heat. It's that time of the year, so we should have scheduled these in October, Carlton.
We'll do another one.
We'll do another one. So how would you like to start? I'm going to let you start off and lead us a little bit.
So one thing I think we should just talk about is the Napa Valley and like its history with Cabernet Sauvignon. And one thing I'll say is really interesting with these wines, because I think we should always obviously be talking about all this in reference to these wines. Is I think one thing we can say is when you smell these wines and you look at them and you taste them, it's very different than probably what people are used to getting from the Napa Valley. And I think I want everyone to remember that and focus on that as we talk about the Napa Valley's history with Cabernet Sauvignon. Because we've seen, as you see in every region, a bit of an evolution of learning and experimenting and trying different styles with the same varietal. We saw it in Burgundy, you see it in Barolo, you see it everywhere. And look at the Napa Valley's grape growing history. We know the history of grape growing goes back to the 1800s, but they really, frankly, didn't know what they were doing. When we talk about people growing grapes for quality winemaking, you're really talking about like post-prohibition, where things are structured. You have actual wineries. It's an actual growing to be an industry. And in that time, 30s, 40s, 50s, winemaking was not a big deal here still. There was a few wineries that really were making a lot of wine and people making garage wine, but it was still a mixed use agricultural area, growing things like nuts and fruits. There was even a massive raisin industry in the middle of the Napa Valley because it was more economically viable to grow grapes for raisin production than for winemaking. So we have to take into consideration that the Napa Valley is a very young region, incredibly young. We talk about quality winemaking, we're really talking about really the 60s is when things like really, really took off, where people started to take the wines somewhat seriously. They still weren't taken very seriously, but it was enough that people were like actually starting to like have like labs and like do research and start to focus on like, maybe these places are a little different. But what you didn't see was in that time was a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon. We obviously know that the Napa Valley was developed by European immigrants, and they brought varietals from all over the world. At that time there was a ton of like Barbera and these sort of things grown in the valley, both red and white, and it really was in its purest form. They were growing grapes for wine producers to have wine to drink, because they weren't making a lot of money doing it. So they really were doing it for the passion of it. They didn't truly understand the terroir and the farming there wholly as far as what varietals were best, but they were actually doing everything that they could, to make the best wine possible. Mostly everything was obviously in bush vines, and a lot of those bush vines were still being planted well into the 70s in general. So, fast forward into the 70s is when you start seeing, obviously after the Paris tasting of 1976, there's movies made about it, there's books written about it, but it really was a massive deal in the Napa Valley. Like it put the Napa Valley on the world's radar. Prior to that tasting, winemakers in Napa Valley were looked as like second rate, almost like third world country winemakers. Like these guys don't know what they're doing, especially by the French. And if you remember in that tasting, most notably, you had the director of Chateau Margaux in that tasting, who tried to sue the crew that put the tasting on for her tasting notes back because she almost lost her job, right? And one thing to note there is that, and this is something that people tend to forget, is the reason that those wines were scored so highly is that they were confused for Bordeaux, right? And we have to remember that. So, and in the 70s, there was a very particular style of Bordeaux that was being produced, very bad Bordeaux. The 70s might have been one of the worst decades of modern history for Bordeaux. Very sort of lean, funky wines, really dirty cellars, not very precise winemaking. Viticulture was at all-time low. It really was like a really bad era for wine. So what they tasted in Napa was really like almost like the best of what they could have expected from Bordeaux. And they actually beat, a lot of the wines actually won by a long shot. It wasn't a slim margin. So we have to remember that as far as when we talk about the great wines of Napa, we have to remember the type of wine, the structure of wine that gained the Napa Valley, its reputation, right? Essentially, you're looking at a more opulent, more well-balanced, more well-made version of Bordeaux in those wines, right? So things come back, it becomes this big deal. Well, all of a sudden, money starts coming in. They go think, well, we need to advance this. We got to compete with Bordeaux. Well, the issue there was that the Napa Valley was already doing it right? You saw a lot of, double Geneva curtain and Napa sprawl and these sort of things that were, they weren't just done haphazardly. This was the training system that was developed or adopted after the bush vine was decided, like, okay, this is not the best way to farm. This is actually, why we should do this. It shades the fruit. It does this. We obviously down in the valley floor, which, they obviously were vineyards up in the mountains. There were mini vineyards up in the mountains. But what we know is like some of the brands that we idolize, where a lot of them were valley floor wineries, like BV, so forth and so on, right? They were making wines in the 60s and early 70s. So we look at that, the big Napa Valley sprawl and so forth. Really what we're looking at is it was a training system that was really engineered and adapted perfectly for the more fertile soils of the valley floor, which gives you a bigger canopy. We also hangs a little bit more fruit to sort of devigor that, and it's all about balance, right? And it was like the perfect size plant for the vigor of that soil. But then, a couple guys go over to Bordeaux and they learn how to Bordelais do it. And they came back and convinced everyone to replant with a ton of Cabernet Sauvignon. And they adopted the vertical shoot positioning system. And that really changed the scape of Napa Valley really forever. Obviously things like Zinfandel, Alicante Boucher, Carignan, all these varietals that were the heritage varietals of Napa Valley. I mean, most of all that was like ripped up. Obviously, there are still some vineyards floating around, but they're sort of peppered around the valley. You'll still find some old 100-year-old vines of Zinfandel up on Howe Mountain, surprisingly. But for the most part, it was all ripped up to adopt Cabernet Sauvignon as the king varietal in the Napa Valley. And the big mistake that was made was it was all done, in Bordelais style, which is vertical shoot positioning and very close to the ground. Well, the issue there is that the Napa Valley is not Bordeaux, and really why we enjoy the end result. If we were to get to the end result and maintain the style of wine we would have in the 70s, VSP wasn't really going to get us there. The fruit's far too exposed, obviously too much heat radiating from the ground. It really was, VSP is perfect for Bordeaux and about one of the worst systems you can use on the valley floor in the Napa Valley. It's just not ideal for warm climate growing, which the Napa Valley is and has always been a warm climate. But Cabernet also, unfortunately, ended up being planted in a lot of the wrong parts of the valley. There wasn't like soil studies done to say, okay, well, this part is great for it, this part isn't, this part is great for it. It became, well, we're all farmers. There were very few wineries at that time. So everyone needed to make money as farmers, not winemakers, right? So if you're a winemaker, obviously you can get more laid-in margin. Well, that wasn't the case. Everyone was selling fruit. What could you get the most for a ton? Cabernet Sauvignon. Great, plant Cabernet everywhere. And that was essentially it was the economy that drove the economy of farming that drove Cabernet Sauvignon being the king of the Napa Valley. And I think had there been more of a culture of farmer winemaking, I don't think we would see as much Cabernet Sauvignon planted in the Napa Valley. And it would have been limited to farming the right varietal in the right soil, because there would have been enough margin in there from winemaking, selling wine, that would prohibit you from having to plant the wrong varietal in the wrong spot. But also with Cabernet Sauvignon there, the current modern style that we see of Cabernet Sauvignon, really, it was almost irreversible stylistically once Cabernet Sauvignon was done in that style, and they were trying to produce, maximum 3 tons to an acre on VSP, and by then you're gonna get raisinated, sun-baked fruit, and you really can't make balanced, fresh, long-lived wine without highly manipulating the wine, unfortunately. And it puts you in a really, really tough position if that is your intention. You sort of don't have the raw material to make that type of wine. So that's sort of where we find ourselves now as Napa Valley, and we'll discuss that more, of saying, well, great, how do we go back and take inspiration from the 70s and go back there and go, okay,
oh shit, am I still there?
they don't like the modern wines, right? When you ask them, what do you feel about Napa wine? Oh, I love the old Napa Valley wines. It's like, well, great. Those are almost two different regions. So it's almost like there is a massive demand for us to go back and take inspiration from that. And I think that leads us a lot to, I think, the wines that we have, in front of us structurally and stylistically.
Keep going, Carlton. I'm trying to get back to you. There we go.
For sure. So, as we talk about that, obviously, one of the things we did when we came here was because we did come here because of how much we loved the wines from the 70s. And we came to study and to be students of the Valley and try to learn as much as we could about how those wines were made, how were the grapes farmed, what was the climate like back then, so forth and so on. And, the thing we heard from a lot of people, frankly, who actually weren't here during that time was, oh, well, everything was virused, so you couldn't get past 23 bricks or so forth. And there were absolutely virus vineyards in Napa Valley, but the entire Napa Valley was not virus stricken. That is incorrect. When you go into planting a vineyard and farming it and harvesting and winemaking with an intention to make balanced wine, you're going to come pretty close almost every year, right? Vintage gives you obviously what it gives you, and you always have to adjust for that. But you're always going to come within a range. It's very hard for me to believe, and for anyone to ever explain to me how just removing a virus takes alcohol levels from 13% to 16, 17%. I'm just not buying that. So, I think that there was a massive intent starting in definitely the late 80s, almost till currently, to make a very different style of wine. And what we're starting to see is that with the right intent, with planting and farming alone, you can make very well balanced wines in this valley. Now, we're not talking about light wines, right? The Napa Valley, with its climate, should not be making light wine. We're not making Pinot Noir, and we're not in a cold climate. That's not what this valley is. It's not what the plant material is. It's not what the climate will give you. It's not what the rainfall will give you. So you shouldn't be making that, but you can make very well balanced wines and very delicious wines. It was a very eye-opening experience for me when I went to visit the Prairie, which is a very warm climate, very warm, super rocky soils, arid, very dry. And if you go around, you can still get in. And also, a lot of the varietals they're growing are not varietals that are known for high acid. And you're still getting very well balanced wine. And a wine being in balance has nothing to do. People often think of high acid as a wine being in balance, right? That's what we think of. And that's not really what a balanced wine is. And it's very difficult to explain a balanced wine, but you know one when you drink one. And you know one when it's out of balance. You can have out of balance wines that have very high acid. And, as we find, and we can talk about it more, is the balance comes from farming correctly. right? You can't make a balanced wine if the grapes, the fruit aren't balanced, the chemistry isn't balanced in the fruit. Obviously, you can manipulate it once it arrives to try to get that balance, but the goal obviously should be to make that balanced wine in the vineyard. And when you come in, you're just sort of guiding it through its process. But if you don't get it in the farming, you're not going to get it here. And I was really amazed to see how many well-balanced wines they got in the pre-rot, and it was hot. I mean, it's very hot in Napa Valley today. It was very similar temperatures in the pre-rot, and their soils are hard rock. I mean, it's schist. It's that licorella, that brown schist soils, and it's radiating heat, and they're making balanced wine. So to me, it's not about heat. It's about intention. Their intention is to make balanced wine. So they farm for it, they plant vines for it, and they make wine that way. And it makes something that is not meant to be a very light wine. These are not 12.5% crunchy reds, right? It is a more opulent style of wine, but wine can be opulent and still balanced.
I think that one of the things you touched on that I will keep coming back to, and we did this in the Pinot Noir and Chardonnay tasting, right, is seeing vineyards, wines that were made that were not necessarily farmed by the person making the wine, that were purchased, that were something that just kind of purchased at the end, versus something that you're seeing through in the entire process. And I think that one of the things that you're talking about in pre-rot, one of the things that you're talking about in 60s, 70s Napa Cab that's so just that hits so hard with me is the fact that there was a style of grape growing and a style of farming that suited the climate of the time. And so right now, and how we've pushed, and I think there was a necessity to push in what we've done, but yet at the same time, we're looking at harvesting earlier and earlier and earlier and earlier because of the way that we're farming. Mm-hmm. And you think of the seasons and maximizing the potential of the season for so many different reasons: skin maturity, the trying to have the right crop to balance to get to that phenolics, all that you want inside those grapes, and yet getting to that, and that golden triangle that we talk about, especially in Napa for so long, is trying to get into that range of where you have the right sugar, the right alcohol with the right acid. And it's an art that's been very, very lost in, I think, the Napa Valley, and pushing. You're seeing a side of coming back to this Geneva double curtain. And for all these styles of trellising, I recommend that you guys, maybe take a note, look online at vertical shoot positioning, VSP, Geneva double curtain, Lyre, Elkhorn, the stuff that we're talking about that was a system here in Napa Valley where we're farming in much bigger rows, much bigger canopies, putting up more crop, as they were, more crop, and holding more on that in a season that elongated the season and got you a lot more of these things that I think equate to more quality in a product, in that skin maturity, balance. And yeah, I think that right now, and we'll go into these wines, and I think that there's a strike toward finding balance again from so many. Yet at the same time, there's some faults in these wines for sure, and riding that line. But yet, for me, there's a big path on how these wines were made and how they got there. So, how do you feel about?
You touched on something here, and I think it's important to talk about. And it touches on a very a point that I feel very strongly about, which is this generalization of almost anything in the world. And the point you made was about yields and hanging fruit. And this is something I think people really need to hear to understand, is that the yield of a plant should be directly correlating to the fertility and the water holding capacity of the soil, right? And the rootstock, right? There's so much that goes into it. And what I mean by that is I don't expect to get the same yield, even with the same rootstock, the same clone, 1,000 feet up the hill with, rockier soils, as I would do 1,000 feet down in the valley floor in some of the heavier soils. Not that all the soils in the valley floor are heavy, but in a heavier soil in the valley floor. And the crop that you need to hang will dramatically affect the balance of your vine, the balance of your fruit structure. If there is this generalization of almost what people tend to say, the 3 tons to an acre rule, I guess, across any region, any soil type in the world. They think anything more than 3 tons an acre is like this bad thing. It's a very ignorant approach, a very closed-minded approach to how to actually grow a vine. It actually shows that you don't understand how a vine works. And if I were to take a fertile vineyard in the Napa Valley and do 3 tons to an acre, you have to understand the vine has a certain amount of energy and power. It has to go somewhere. And if I prune down and I'm dropping, I want less fruit because I read that less, a smaller crop is a better quality fruit. The energy has to go somewhere. So you tend to just get a really, really vegetative plant where you just constantly just going in and just slashing and slashing the vine, which really the goal is to not have to cut the vine as often as possible, because you got to put energy there. But that's where you also get a lot of these wines that have these really intense dry black fruit characteristics, but they still have a ton of green on them. Is because the vine has never left a vegetative state and your fruit is baked. So it ripens way too fast, and you're going to get those black raisinated fruit characters and green. So when you try those wines, and it sounds like this weird disconnect. It's like, how do you get fruit so ripe and so high in alcohol and so rich, but then green? It's because the vine is dramatically out of balance. You can taste the lack of balance of the vine in the wine. Because again, if you bring fruit in that's out of balance, the wine will be as well, aromatically and structurally. So you really have to judge almost in each row. When we look at, if we have to irrigate, we try to work, and especially in Rutherford, we do this because where a lot of our vineyards, we do have continuous soil types down rows. In Rutherford, because it goes up down this sort of, gentle slope down to the flats, that's just one row where you can't treat the top of the slope the same way you do the bottom of the slope. So you have to have double irrigation wires. And so if you irrigate, we only irrigate the very top where it's very poor soils, and that's the most likely to need it. Where the bottom, you can potentially dry farm, right? So you don't want to have to treat all of it the same. I was telling Matt once about this story from Tim Mondavi. He was talking about farming the Tokelon vineyard back when his family had it. And they had a farmer there that used to get 10 tons to the acre. And that's a lot, right? Typically if you're on a poor soils, you should expect somewhere between usually 2.5 to 3, depending on where you are. Sometimes actually less, depending on where you are. In the valley floor, close to 5, 4 to 5, again, depending on where you are. It's a big range, there's no generalization. But he was getting 10 because it was the water holding capacity of this part of Tokelon was massive. And they just call him 10-ton Tony because he would always get 10 tons of Cabernet, Tony would, in this block of the vineyard. But if you taste those wines, if you taste Tim Mondavi's, Tokelons from the late 70s or 80s, they're brilliant wines. And he was getting 10 tons the acre on that. But no one would go back and go, oh, well, he wasn't farming for quality. He actually understood how a vine works in various soils. But I can tell you the things that he were getting up on the slope were not 10 tons. He was probably getting 3 up there, right? So when we talk about farming, it's a very difficult thing to understand. It's very hard to do. Matt spends a lot of time in the vineyard trying to get that understanding because every row is very different. Every plant is very different. Trying to look at it and tell if it's in balance and learning how to pivot when it's not. And when you're in a warm climate, it's a warm, dry climate. It's super important that you're finding that balance. So you do get a longer growing season.
Well, and as a farmer, I'm sure not only he understood the plant, but he also probably understood the economics that if he could ripen 10 tons of Cabernet, he'd get a lot more money than if he ripened 5 tons of Cabernet.
Especially at Tokelon prices.
Especially at Tokelon price, which have always been high. But I think that, coming back to a point that you made and something that is to touch on one more time is that when you talked about pre-Arrat, it's a very good example. And so many of these old world kind of models that we look at. And there was a necessity for us to copy, to jump in and being such a young industry, finding methods and ways to bring them over here to experiment, to do things, to necessarily modernize, to do things better than we were doing them. Even though we had maybe hit a very good balance from people that were growing to ripen their crop through that entire season and bring it in. there was a necessity to modernize and get it a little bit better. But when you look at these areas that you're talking about, there's centuries of Selection Massal, of picking for something that in an area like Priorat, where you will have more aeration in that volcanic soil, you're getting a side of plants that are very small, that are ripening the right amount of fruit, but are ripening that in a very, very long season.
Yeah.
In that heat. There's still a varietal that's going to not ripen in August, like we're seeing this year in the Napa Valley all around here. But even now, we're ripening stuff in September, early September, and we're not pushing into those Octobers as much.
Yeah.
There's certain areas of Napa that are, and this is a bigger conversation, but I think that it's that side of finding that balance to place. And we're very, very poor at that in this area. I feel that there's, and you touched on this before, is, you know, you come in, you grab 4 of the main winemakers in the Napa Valley that make your wine, you grab 4 of the main farmers in the area that do it. And for the most part, for decades, that was, you know what, VSP, this type of farming works and gets the crop that these guys want. We're just going to just blast this out and do it everywhere. And who wants to see Geneva double curtain kind of hanging more fruit? All of these people are shouting at me to grow 3 tons per acre. And if you can make it 2, do it. And why kind of keep pushing out this side of balance? I remember early on with Steve Mathiasen, when we were at Arajo, Steve came in and was like, you know, we can hang for, you know, 4.5 tons per acre out here on this. And it was just blasphemy. How can you, this is unheard of. And Steve was
like, we probably not only we can, it's like we probably should be.
We probably should be. And it's a side of just that thought process to go over there didn't necessarily ring true. And I think that there's a big pushback for all of us. If you haven't, and you're, you know, I know a good number of people in this tasting have a lot of experience with Cabernet, and there's maybe some more novice points that we're hitting on, but for those that haven't gone back and tried 60s and 70s Cabernets from Napa Valley, and pretty much I would say it's across the board when you're buying producers from that era, you are bound to hit just jewels of wines. And I think that if I may, in kind of the process to get to these wines versus what I was making, I was making wine at the Islay Vineyard at Arajo, starting in 04 and 05, 06, and 07, I started making the wines. And I remember when I took that over in 07, I asked Bart and Daphne if we could do a vertical of all of the Islay Vineyards, starting back with the first wines. And we pulled out the 71 that Paul Draper made from Ridge. We pulled out the 74 Kong Creek. There was just all of these wines made by a guy named Norm Minnie, who was their home winemaker. Even in vintages, you know, poor vintages that didn't get bottled, the Islay's bottled a vintage. And they had all of the Phelps wines, and then also these Norm Minnie wines that were being made at the same time. And this was just that aha moment of that balance, that level of energy, that level of vibrancy and tension that came in that started to disappear and dissipate later on for a heavier, more saturated product. And without going too far into that, I think the point of that was that aha moment was a side of, well, not how are we going to be achieving and bringing that type of balance of those wines back into the wines of today. And there was a side of every year pushing lots, pushing fermentations, pushing viticulture to get fermentations that did that. And then every single time we got to a blending session, it was, you know, great job, I need more of this. And just the soul got sucked out every single time of, here's this beauty, and no, I need more of this over here. And so it was that side of, I remember stepping away from there and calling up Paul or writing him a letter and saying, this, you changed my life. This is, you know, set me on a path toward making wine in this vein. And, you know, I've never met you, and I'd love to, I'm coming through that way. And Paul responded that day and said, you know, come see me. And we sat down in this kitchen and opened up all these bottles. But talk about a mentor and somebody that remembered every single vintage, everything that went on. And you talk about farming back then, and there was a lot of, we didn't know what we were doing. And a lot of the vintage just hit right at the time. But yet at the same time, I think there was a level of farming, there was a level of curiosity, a level of
Mhm.
involvement, and a level of a natural balance that was right for the area, that was extending and capturing those long seasons for that amount of crop, that brought it in. And I just, yeah, if we can make more wines like that, well,
There has to be an intention to do that, right? I mean, this isn't this idea of people just get lucky and make a balanced, elegant wine is incorrect. There's a plan to this thing, right? I mean, I mean, it's not like you just walked in one day and found out you were making the wine. You just threw the grapes in and it just happened, right? Like there's an intent from farming all through the season till you're bottling the wine to make a certain style of wine, right? If not, then no one would ever need to hire a winemaker. You could just do it yourself, right? So there's a skill and intent to getting a wine down that path. As you can say, like you took the same vineyard and you made a very different style of wine. So clearly the variable there is the intent in the winemaker. And in saying, okay, great, well, what if everyone was a little bit more closely in touch with their land and understanding what it took to make that style of wine, or even desired to make that style of wine? We talk about things changing and having a region go to a very particular style of wine. Well, then my question would be, is the desire and the intent there? Because the desire and intent isn't there, it won't ever happen. And then I live in the world of problem solving. My question is like, okay, well, how do you build that desire? It'll come from the wine buyer. That's who's going to decide, and they'll be forced to do it. But I think people like you and a lot of the other winemakers we have on our team, you have to go in with that intent. We deal with it right now every day, and it's like, okay, well, what are we doing to make the style of wine we want? And if it's not where it is now, great. Well, that vintage we learn, how do we get there next year? And that starts now.
yeah,
I literally woke up this morning, I'm looking at sampling, I'm like looking at the box, I'm like, great. Well, I'm like, shit, like that's okay, but it's not where we want it to be. I'm like, okay, how soon can we have a meeting to talk about this? But then I have to remember we're in the middle of harvest. So the last thing winemakers want to do, if I was to sit down and have a meeting about it, but I'm like taking notes and like logging all that stuff, going, great. Like it is this, again, if the intent is to make this style of wine, it's a journey that you have to constantly be on, and it doesn't end. It's like every year, and it starts the year before, right? Like I'm already thinking about next year's harvest because there's very little we can do this year if we wanted to change anything, right? There's certain things you can do here and there, but you're so far down. I'm going, okay, great. I'm very happy with what we have so far this year, but it can be better and it can be more of what we want it to be. So if that's the goal, like you have to start almost a season before, making sure you're learning to get there. But it takes a lot of work and a lot of, again, intent. It's a word I use all the time because that's what drives a lot of your effort and what you do every day in your life. Is like, what are you intending to do? Like what are you putting your energy and thought into doing? And if the goal is to make this style of wine, then this won't ever happen. And I think, tasting through these wines, I think these, we use the phrase all the time, our future is in our past, right? And I think these wines, tasting through now, I think they are both the past and the future at the same time. And looking at when you were making these wines, I don't think there was a lot, obviously we know the tides are starting to turn now, but I think these, unfortunately, there's not a whole lot of these floating around. But I think it'd be very interesting, some of these in like 20 years and talk about where the Napa Valley was in 15, 16 versus I think optimistically where it will be in 20 years. I think that's going to be, I think this is something you should be really proud of in your team at the time with this brand of like going, great, we were doing this shit even when like it wasn't popular, like people aren't like knocking down the door for a lot of this. But even though I think these actually did get really good scores, if I'm not mistaken, right?
they did. But I think that let's jump into them and talk about where that maybe inspiration came from, the process in them,
Yeah.
and what I think is so special and wonderful about them, and then yet at the same time, what maybe were the learning parts and what are some of the negatives about these wines that aren't in the perfect place. Things that I think that moving forward, you can maybe imagine the writing, they're writing very, very fine lines of tension and where they're at. And I think that we start with a 15, for example.
Yeah.
Do you want to start and touch on before I jump into my thought process in making this wine and where we went to and what happened with it before.
Yeah, so I think it's actually very interesting to try it next to the 16, because I think you really see vintage here. Like, you really see vintage variation in the way it should be, in these wines. Both I think the fruit profile is very different. The aromatics are very different. Like, to me, in its purest form, this does not smell like Bordeaux. This smells like really great Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon, right? In the sense that it does taste sun-kissed, but it's incredibly well balanced. What percentage of Cabernet Franc are in these?
Around 20%.
Okay.
Both vintages.
We've discussed this, but I feel very strongly about Cabernet Franc in the Napa Valley and what it can add to Cabernet Sauvignon as a classical blending agent. When I was up in the Uco Valley, they talked about Malbec, and they talked about them adding Cabernet Franc to Malbec, and how Cabernet Franc had always been this sort of secret sauce used in a lot of regions around the world, Bordeaux, but it's sort of like the unsung hero of the blend. And I think what it brings to the 15, it really stands out in the 15, the Cabernet Franc characteristic. And there is this very like garrigue herb characteristic of like bay laurel and like oregano and rosemary. And I think what you see is a consistent thing where we're not talking about fruit profile here. There are those, what we would describe as earth characteristics. They're not really earth characteristics. They're sort of these secondary earthy varietal characteristics that like are blowing up in the 15. But the fruit is red fruited and very regal, which I love. It's not, the fruit isn't the serious part. It's like supporting the herbaceousness, which is the serious part. And something we should also note here is the misnomer that Cabernet Sauvignon is a black fruited varietal. When we look at a lot of modern Cabernet Sauvignon, you look at the glass, you smell it, and you taste it, and it's all black fruit. And Cabernet Sauvignon, when farmed properly, in my opinion, harvested properly, and made properly in an elegant fashion, with gentle infusion and lighter extraction, it's actually red fruited with black fruit peppered in, and you see that in all the classical Cabernet Sauvignons. It is not black fruit.
Well, I invite you in this wine. Yes, I think that co-ferments all across the board, just like human species, mixes tend to be a little bit better in the long run than just non-blending. But these co-ferments, especially Cabernet Franc with Cabernet Sauvignon, does have, I think, that lift and that added spice that we're looking for, and especially in the whole cluster side. When you can get Cabernet Franc ripe, in the right spot in California, again, where we're talking about it, we're trying to compare with Bordeaux, and I kept talking about this with Pascaline. We're sitting in a parallel equal with Lisbon, southern Spain, Athens, Greece, and we're sitting in this line of sun quality and sugar quality that is going to be completely different than when you start heading up toward Bordeaux and Burgundy and all of these places that get a very different quality of sunlight.
Sun is the thing. People often think about temperature, but it's not just temperature.
No,
it's sun. Like, I track every classical region in the world on my phone temperature, and there are many days where Montalcino is a lot hotter than Napa Valley, where Beaune is hotter than Napa Valley. But what they don't have is as much sun as we have. We have so much sun here. That is the difference.
Yeah, for the entire season, and a lack of rain. But I think that when you look at this wine, number one, this was one of the things that I found at Arajo in making those wines is that I was constantly wanting more and more green in the fermentation, be it trying to destem harder and kind of fiercer to get more green jacks, get more green out of it, because there was something in those ferments that was constantly impressing and building and a level of structure that you didn't get just from trying to get all of these berries taken off the stems. And there's a side of this wine here that this wine went into a concrete tank, that 80-20 Cab Sauv, Cab Franc, 100% whole cluster. And this was my first time doing whole cluster, 100% on Bordeaux varietals. And so there was some anxiety and nervousness in that because it's that side of, I didn't have any real teachers to talk to about this in California with whole cluster on Bordeaux varietals. And so this wine pushed, and these are extended maceration. So I think this wine was in tank for about 40 days, and the 16 was in tank for about 45, 50 days.
What temperature are you fermenting at?
Warm. These probably got up to around 90, high 80s. So they definitely burned off some of that fruit, but these were meant to be and built structurally for sure. And there's a side in that in these wines that they, so the 15 got toward that back end, and there started to become a green note in there that I freaked out on. And so I scraped out, as many rakuses as I could and stems, and got them out, and it continued to kind of push that vein a little bit. So I wound up pressing it earlier than I would have liked to. And so there was a little bit more kind of firmness, harshness in the tannins than the 16 evolved to. And yet it went into bigger demi-muise, big 600-liter barrels with, much bigger staves, a little more reductive environment. And this got bottled in 2019. And what I will say is that one of the things that I found, and
so 2015 got bottled in 2019.
Bottled in 2019.
Yeah.
And so one thing that to understand is that one thing that you learn with 100% whole cluster is that fermentations are difficult to get started when you're doing it without inoculating them. With 100%, it's tough. There's not the juice. There's not that heat that builds up down there. And so one of the things that I had learned earlier was body treading. I body treaded these to get them going. But one of the things that has really helped is putting in a pied de cuve. And a pied de cuve is basically getting some grapes going earlier. A lot of winemakers would just have an inoculant that they make that they throw into a fermentation tank. That's not what this is. This is grapes that are harvested about a week earlier. They get going, and when they're at that peak, they get thrown into the tank, and it's an inoculant that makes that ferment go right away. And since doing the
sourdough starter,
it's a sourdough starter. So in doing that, you kind of you skip this process of, especially in whole cluster wines, this kind of lag phase where that bacterial soup likes to jump up and have other things start to get a higher population count, so that when Saccharomyces is done with the fermentation, these guys are lingering around with their forks and knives saying, what's left to eat, and they start taking off. And I think the way with pied de cuves is, instead of having an entire dining hall full of, little guys with forks and knives, you have a little kind of kids table of things left over at the end. So there's not as much, things to take off and jump around. And ever since doing so, levels of bacteria and yeast that we're not looking for have not been an issue. But when you look at the 15, one of the things when it came out of that and went into barrel was there was a level of VA that was a little bit higher. And you're going to get that in this wine. You get that little high tone, that little slight vinegar, that little volatile acidity, that little bit of fingernail polish remover, a tiny bit in there. And it's prominent in that. And I think it blows off a little as we sit here. But I think there's a side that I look beyond that, which is looking at where that structure is at on that wine with 100% whole cluster and harvested at a level. And what's the alcohol on this? This one, it still came in at 14.8. Yeah. So this is something that was made with almost no sulfur all the way to the back end, and just held. So I think that when you look at the 16, again, I didn't finish these wines.
Okay. So
At the time,
yeah.
I divorced from Chamboulay, and I didn't get to finish and bottle them. So what was actually done at the back end was that level and riding that line of tension. I think that maybe there was a side of them not being ridden as hard. So a few things kind of crept into the VA got a little more prominent on this wine. Yeah. And then in the 16, just jumping to it very quickly, this was again about 80% Cab Sauvignon and 20% Cab Franc. And you have a wine that, again, 100% whole cluster, but this was in tank for around 50 days. And there was a side of being able to get those tannins into a place that I think this wine, again, is a game changer for me, in what can be done in Napa Valley and picking stuff. I'm trying to see, what did this one come in at? Yeah, 14.2. I'd still like to see us farming to be able to do this at, under 14% alcohol. And, but yet at the same time, do you get much greenness from the whole cluster on this one?
No, it's it's really interesting. One we should say is obviously doing whole cluster fermentation with this is not very common in Bordeaux varietals. Because I think there is this desire to have wines that have softness and suppleness and polish too early on. And I think that's incorrect, especially if your goal is to make wines that will age in cellar for a long time. I think if you're making wines that are pop and go, then I understand the desire. Those wines are going to be consumed within the first year. You really should, you're making those wines for that occasion. But if your goal is like, I want to make a great wine that will progress over the next 60 years, and I'm not understating that, like I really think the great wines of the world will develop it, sometimes more, obviously, then you need to have a structure of a wine that will last that long, right? And slowly integrate. And what I see from the tannins here, they remind me almost of like very elegant Nebbiolo tannins, where they're here, but they're really, I think they're still very silky. I don't think they're chunky. They're not very hard. And there's actually very little green on any of these wines. That outside of the green, like the green olive bay laurel characteristic you just get from Cabernet Franc, that's a variety.
A good green.
Yeah, I mean, I actually like green in Cabernet Sauvignon and Cabernet Franc a lot. Actually, I think it's almost should be a requirement. It is the varietal characteristic, and if you're ripening it past that, you've lost the varietal characteristic. It's like Pinot Noir. When you ripen it too much, it tastes like Zinfandel, Grenache. You've lost the varietal characteristic of the grape. Every grape has there's a point where you lose the character of the grape in the place where it's just gone. You can't get it back. It doesn't matter how much water back you add. You can't get the flavor. You pass that threshold. And I think these are well within that threshold, but they're not pyrazine green. Right. They have that developed herbaceous garrigue sort of green characteristic that you get from Cabernet Franc and properly ripe Cabernet, but not overripe. But it's definitely not stemmy. It's not the stemmy green you get from like Dujac, right? Surprisingly, it doesn't show itself like that at all.
No, and I guess again, I hope that what we're looking at here and this tasting for me is a side of saying, these are educational foundations for figuring out something and moving forward for myself in the Napa Valley. And again, making some Cabernet, but I think coming to work with you on a project.
Well, I was going to get with that because the first time I heard about these wines was before you told me about them. When Nico Quay was making our wines down at Haynes, but he's also doing another like sort of secret project that we've been working on that's very experimental. It's a really cool concept. But the first thing he thought of, he's like, Carlton, I really think this vineyard that we're working on could benefit from some stems. And I'm like, stems? I was like, that's Cabernet Sauvignon, right? Like he's used to making Pinot Noir. I'm like, what is he, is he starting to lie? Like, it's Cabernet, Nico. And he's like, yeah, dude. I'm like, I've never had Cabernet Sauvignon knowingly that had stems included intentionally. And we started talking about the history of Napa Valley the pre-prevalence of destemmers in general and how there was an effort to destem, but you always end up having somewhere, 10 to 15% just always floating in there, right? And what that brings to the wine. And then he mentioned your wines, the Chamboulets. This is when I started reaching out to you to talk about the project that we had up on the Hal Mountain in Incrade. Because for me, I like people who are want to try different things, who say, this is the status quo. I don't want to try different for different sake. I just think it can be better. So let's try different things to get it better, right? I think that is like a general thing you should always, when you have a craft and you have something that you commit your life to as a craft, you should always be trying to do it the very best you possibly can. It's something I love about the Japanese, right? That they commit, they go, this is what I do for my life. I have one life, I'm gonna do it really well, right? And that I absolutely admire. So I was like, oh, I got to reach out to this guy. And so when we started talking, because I think what you smell in these wines is there's a lifted aromatic, there's a layer that you don't commonly get in Cabernet Sauvignon in the Napa Valley, in most places in the world. And it makes a very different wine. It makes a very unique wine. The way that in Burgundy, you see this massive disconnect between those that are in favor of stems and those that are not, right? Now you start to see people who are in the gray. Oh, I had 20% so forth, but there used to be a very distinct line. I am stems and I am not, right? And it was like, but they make it's almost a completely different wine. And the funny thing is no matter how much I taste and admire the wines of Henri Jayer, which I think they're really, really genius wine, right? I love Domaine Dujac.
Which is D-stem. We'll come back.
Correct. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
He's
D-stem, long cold soak. I mean, extraction, 100% new oak, no stems. And Dujac is, I mean, to me, those wines with age, when you smell the moment you pour them, you just want to eat. You just like want to gobble them up. They just smell so delicious. And the same thing for Domaine Loire, and the same thing for DRC. When I went to visit Christophe Perrault-Minot, who I befriended after a number of years, he started talking about how much he loved starting to use stems, and he makes a pretty opulent style of wine. But even getting deeper into him learning from Lalubis Loire, how they would take like Joyce Chin scissors and cut the cluster open and cut the middle rachis out, because that was the one that would make the ferments green, right? I mean, there was a religious following behind stems in this school of thinking that I think, what we're tasting here, what it does is it brings a different category to Napa Valley Cabernet Sauvignon. To me, that aromatically is far more intriguing, right? You're talking about a wine in its purest form. It should be intriguing and want to make you drink more of it. These wines make you want to keep smelling it and keep tasting it.
Well, I think that one of the things that we touched on with Pascaline that I agree with is that, number one, I think that stems work very, very well with the amount of sun that we have here. Now, that has a dual-edged sword, right? Because number one, I think that they work with the quality of sugars, and they work in how they work with the fermentation and providing freshness. And there's a freshness that comes back from the stems. But one of the kind of that double-edged sword in that is that you also have a side of typical in Napa Valley and in California farming, is that we are not harvesting at acid levels that they're harvesting in Bordeaux and in Burgundy, and having these kind of more acid naturally from the very get-go in the beginning. And so there's a danger there, because with these wines, you're kind of pushing up closer to a pH of 3.8, 3.9, closer to 4. And when you do that, you're leaving yourself open to a lot of potential gashes and wounds that make it a much harder line to ride. So I think that, number one is, I definitely see a place for stems in certain sites. It's not a dogmatic thing. It's a thing where these sites had some freshness, a side of they could be coupled well, and tasting those stems. I've never had a lignified a stem in California that turns brown and turns woody.
I was going to ask you that.
And not in any varietal. And I know that they're there. People talk about them. I've never seen one. For me, they're neon green or they're lime green, but it makes no difference. It's what they taste like. Do they come across crazy harsh, or do they come across very kind of herbaceous, pyrazine? Does that come across? No, I think for the most part, even though they're neon green, you get a side of them being sweet. You get a quality of sugar that's not in the grapes, another quality of sugar that comes in. You get a side of sweetness. You get a side of eating them and tasting them that has something that you can see as when alcohol is going to get at the back end and start leaching out and pulling from those. It's actually something that has another form of a quality of bitterness, a quality of structure that comes in at the back end that I love. That I want that bitterness on the back end as well, to just grab you, to hold you. And I think Napa Cabernet today is kind of, it's all about that, just that plushness. And God forbid you have bitterness in a wine. I want that on the back end. And I think that when we're talking about Barolo, Nebbiolo, when we're talking about these wines that kind of have hit us and changed our lives, there's bitterness on the back end, and you want a little bit of that. So again, it's that concept of stems bringing freshness, which I think is counterintuitive when you start thinking about what stems might lend. And now it's just a matter of what we're doing on this project, which I don't know that we've really talked about with anybody, but in doing this project, it's going to be farming this property so that we can get a more natural, a longer season, a more natural acid that's coming through when they're kind of maybe getting out of those hard pyrazines and into having that little bit of greenness and such. But as far as what I'm tasting up at the property for my first year being up there,
Yeah.
the stems don't have anything that I'm looking at saying, man, I wouldn't want to use. The stems are going to find a place in some of these ferments.
That's great. And the great thing about it is, and I look at it because I look at the Diamond Mountain property here on the 15 and 16, which is also high altitude east facing, and looking at something that is very similar. Obviously, it's a different valley, but the same thing. Those high elevations, they stay cooler. They don't have as much of a diurnal shift. They tend to not get as hot during the day, but they also don't get as cold during the night. So you pretty much just get like pretty stable like temperatures for the most part. It's like this instead of like this, and you don't see those crazy high temps. But it takes a while to
except for this year.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, but it's like it takes a while to get cranking, and then once it gets going, it's like a diesel engine, like it just goes. But it takes a really long time at the beginning of the year to get going, and then it catches up, which is pretty incredible. But I think for what I'm surprised of is that the tannins to be mountain Cabernet Sauvignon, I think with stems, I don't think the tannins here are big and chunky at all. So what do you do to prevent that from being an issue? And looking at what would you say sort of would be the approach for Valley Floor using stems? Because those are essentially probably the two, big categories of soil types. Is that Valley Floor, slightly more plush, softer fruit profile, and mountains with stereotypically more aggressive tannins.
I think if you're going to get into the process of using stems in your fermentation, you have to understand that you're going to need to spend some time in tank. So these wines were incredibly aggressive, incredibly hard, and in that fermentation process, there was a ton of structure built and put into them and extracted out of them, going down to where they start to finish and get dry and start to slow down in their ferment at the back end. And so there's a side of understanding that you are going to be getting into, I hope we're not geeking out too much, you're going to get into a side of alcohol being present that is not only going to be stripping from the rachis, the stems, that's going to be stripping from the seeds. There's a ton of components on that back end that are going to start being pulled out of those wines, which I think is wonderful for that longevity, right? Coming back to that side in that those, even on pressing, getting down to that level around the seeds and what comes out of the seeds from a lees perspective and from a longevity perspective is a side of you're getting into some stuff that is very, very harsh and very, very hard. So you need that time and tank to kind of, if you will, polish. And so 15, for example, was built up just like the 16, but it didn't have the chance to get as polished when I got freaked out and pressed it. So you still have the 15 has a more aggressiveness side, more than the 16.
It doesn't have the mid to carry all that.
It doesn't. Well, and I think that
in a vacuum, you taste the wine by itself. You're like, this is great. But it's not that you try it next to the 16. You can see is like that there's a base note in the 16 that the 15 doesn't have, that just carries like a foundation that carries everything else.
Yeah, and so that's 100% right. In that 16 and where it was able to kind of encapsulate and form itself a little bit more rounded, is that there is so much structure. And we talked about this in the Pinot Noir in last week with at the property. Is a lot of people would say this is a middle lightweight Pinot, and for me, it's the kind of side of, you have no idea how huge and massive these wines are in tank and how they're built up. And they get polished in that at that back end, but there is a ton there, and that bitter, there's so much that went into that. And same in this 15 and 16. There's a ton of tannin that was built into it, but hopefully there's a side of that being polished. And I think that there's a freshness for the alcohol level of what's coming off of Diamond Mountain. Now our job is to have, like I said, be able to farm these and get them to where we want to, so that we're making 13% Cabernets and being able to do this and provide that freshness with the whole cluster. And that kind of makes a segue into the 17, which is that 100% Cab Franc. And this is not my favorite Cab Franc of the Francs that we produce from Caldwell. It's the only one that there was any wine left to do a tasting with, because everything's sold. But I think that, this is an example of Cab Franc, which you really have to wait to have it get past that, staunch pyrazine side. And farmed right, you have a longer season. It's a cool, Cabernet Franc in cool sites just takes that long season and gets past that, but you could still get it at a really, really fresh kind of lower level of alcohol. And it just, when Cab Franc hits on that level, I don't think there's anything like it in the world from
I love
Bordeaux.
I love Cabernet. Like, to me, it fills my sort of hunger for that, the secondary earth notes, those herbaceous notes, that black olive. Like, to me, it's like, it makes me want to keep smelling it. To me, like, I obviously love drinking wine, but to me, I love smelling like incredibly complex wines. And especially in Bordeaux varietals, when you get those notes. I was texting you the other night when we talked about the 87 Dunhill Mountain I had that, where it was like that. It was a lot of black olive and a touch of pyrazine, and it just, the more it was in the decanter, the mid started to fatten up, and it started to blossom with all that richness of fruit. That on top of it, it was just such an exceptional wine. And to me, I think if I'm drinking a Bordeaux varietal, I want those. It keeps me interested in the wine. These sort of one-noted wines that are, again, they're like barbecue sauce, but they're sort of like sweet, smoky, fat, to me, they're so uninteresting. Like, after like
Barbecue sauce, that's a great one.
Yeah, it appeals to that palate. It's like just like sweet, smoky sort of wines that I just find them uninteresting. Like, I want more layers. I think Cabernet Franc adds those layers that sometimes Cabernet Sauvignon, it needs that. It can sometimes be incomplete in certain vintages. Like, it needs something to fill the holes. And obviously we know Cabernet Franc, to me, I think has a bigger chance of doing that in the Napa Valley than Merlot. Because Merlot, I think, depending on the site, there's very few places in the Napa Valley, I think Merlot can keep its cut, and keep its red fruit component without going over and just adding fatness to the wine, which we don't need, right? We don't need fatness. You sort of need to fill in some holes with Cabernet. And I think Cabernet Franc can do that very well. And speaking to that, have you done whole cluster with Merlot?
I have not yet.
I think that might be in our near future.
100%, especially, well, do we want to talk about our near future and
Sure.
You don't have to. We don't have to.
No, absolutely. I have no problem talking about it. It's pretty, I'm obviously very excited about it. I know you are, but so we bought this vineyard when we bought Heights, and it was an incredible site that actually most people in the Napa Valley don't even know it exists. One of the reasons was it was owned by the Heights family, but it was never really used by the Heights family. It's an 800-acre ranch that used to belong to Theron Inc., who was one of the big pioneers in the Napa Valley. If you've heard of Inc. Grade Road, that road is named after his family. He owned 3,000 acres back there at one point. He also owned a ton of land in Rutherford. The Inc. house is right next to Whitehall Lane. That was his house. So this place that he had back on the backside of Howe Mountain, it's Howe Mountain by appellation, but it really should be its own thing. It's on the other side of the mountain. It's east facing, and there are very few people who own land on this side of the hill. And this is a retreat for his family. He grazed cattle there. The Samuels family planted a small vineyard there at one point. When we cleared the land, we found a lot of redwood stakes from the original plantings, as well as some copper stills, because a lot of the bootleggers used to go back there and use the natural springs to distill. he had a house there where all the pioneers who came up over that road to go into the Napa Valley would stop and rest and spend the night at his hotel there and then go over. So tons of history there. We have 800 acres, probably 750 acres, and there's 220 acres planted that go from 700 feet to roughly 2,400 feet in elevation. So obviously a lot of different scape to play with. And one of the things we really love about the site is there's no, when we look at marketing material, people want to hear about a soil type and an aspect and so forth. And Incrate doesn't really have that. It's like you could be walking down the row and the road in the scape turn like 180 like completely while you're walking down the row, and you have these beautiful terrace vineyards that form these beautiful bowls. And it's just, there is no generalization you can make about this site in general. But what's great about it is we developed it and it's never really seen like chemical farming. We've never seen any Roundup. It's been farmed organically since the beginning. And now we're converting it to biodynamics. So we hired on Matt Taylor, and he's working with Brittany, who's our winemaker at Heights, to make some pretty exceptional wines up there. And that's when I sort of step away and let them do the work.
Well, I think that when you look at Incrate, just imagine if you've seen pictures of Priorat, of the Douro, of areas of the world that just are sitting on slopes that come down with terrace vines. You just don't see that in the Napa Valley in very many places, where it's just, 700 to 2,400 feet in a matter of going like this. And you just, again, you're going on these hillsides that are wrapping on the side of this mountain that are 30-year-old vines, and just have, being handed a 30-year-old vineyard on slopes and terraces like this, where nobody's really done a single vineyard wine from, is pretty exceptional. So,
in giving carte blanche to farm it how it needs to be farmed to make the styles of wine I'm going to make, and I think these are tasting these Diamond Mountain wines. I think these are really great inspirations for what we want to produce.
Well, I think that if anything, there's a lot to be learned in the site for myself in what was done and notes that were taken from these wines to get better and better at what we're doing, and how I see Napa Valley not replicating what was done in the 60s and 70s, but harnessing what was so good about that and trying to bring that kind of aspect of balance, vibrancy, tension back into Napa cabs. And that bumper sticker that we have on our forklift that is, make Napa Cabernet great again, is just that side of, I think that coming to a lot of these wines is trying to find that level of levity that comes in, that we're just, so many of these wines are just being weighted down, saturated, heavy, and trying to find that lift and that balance. And I don't necessarily think that whole cluster is an answer for everything, but I do think that some of these wines up there are going to benefit from it. And I think that, again, just the nice thing about this piece is it's not all vertical shoot positioning. It's Geneva double curtain, it's elk, it's lyre. There's a lot of aspects of just an old style of California farming that is we're already seeing it in this vintage, and seeing this heat wave and how they're holding through this, and not shriveling up and being able to hold in. So I'm excited, and
which is that very consistent with like pretty naturally farmed older vines in general, like being able to weather these sort of situations. What they have from Priorat, a lot of old vines. And, when you look at the Napa Valley farmers who just love ripping and replanting all the time, which to me is insane, they have to understand the importance of having old vines in a warm climate, especially one that's dry, is that they can deal with warm drought conditions and be pretty even killed. If you look at, what Nico has down in Coombsville, and as we segue to talking about Coombsville, is he's got Winty Clone Chardonnay from the 60s that is, we have one small part that's even hit 20 bricks. Everything else is like 16 bricks, and it is just like cruising. And these are really old vines, and like like, I mean, they're just like, no, we're good, and there obviously is a temperature variation between Coombsville and, let's say, Calistoga, but it's not crazy. It's probably 10 degrees roughly on every day, but they're still it's still a warm vineyard, right? Coombsville's still warm. And they are like cruising along. So I think having older vines definitely also helps to weather these heat spikes like we have always had in the Napa Valley and we'll always continue to have. It's never going to be a cool place with a lot of rainfall, right?
Well,
So,
the shock's still there. I mean, whether you're on the Sonoma coast, as I see, where I'm living in a realm of upper 70s, low 80s. When I
yeah,
jump into the 90s, that's still a huge shock to the vine
yeah,
and what they're used to as far as amount of heat and where it's coming from, and whether that's on Howell Mountain jumping from 90s to 100 plus, or Hain jumping from upper 80s to upper 90s. There's still a big shock there, but I think that side of being able to handle that shock. Are you okay jumping into some of the Q&A and some of the chat and
please.
what we see there? Mr. Jeffrey, barrel treatment on these wines. Basically in the 15, what you have is you have 3 demi-muis, 3 600-liter vessels. One of them was new and 2 of them were used. In the 16, you have, I think, 4 demi-muis, 3 used and 1 new. So I hate to say that's 25% new oak, because this isn't 228-liter barrels that we're talking about. This is 2.5 times the size of barrel and much thicker staves. And then in the 17 Cabernet Franc, if I recall, you're looking at about 2 barrels, 2 600 liters, 1 new, 1 used. So all 600 liters. There always is a 228 liter that maybe came from a breakdown, to have something that can be eventually broken down for topping wine, but you're mainly looking at 600-liter barrels on all of these wines. Regarding, maybe you can answer this one. Peter wrote, the difference between 15 and 16 significant. Both are tannic and very young. The 16 is relatively muted overall. Can you say something about how these will evolve as they mature?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think so the VA in the 15, so that's the one. VA really, one thing I like about VA, and I think it's tough because I think most wine drinkers don't get it, they don't understand it, and they don't like it. So it's really difficult to have it included in wine. I think it really does lift aromatics. Like there's something about it. It's just like it brings out more of that the brightness, and it just explodes the aromatics. 16 to me, I don't think it's muted. I think the wine is in a very different phase, but it also, again, it has more muscle and it has more bass to it. So it's more bass notes. 15 to me, that early press off would naturally just give you more high tone red fruit aromatics. But what I can say is I think 16 to me will be the more long-lived wine. I think you have more phenolic development through the fermentations in the mouth. It hits. I always judge how a wine's going to age by how all the pressure points in the mouth that it hits. Right? Is it hitting everything it's supposed to hit in the mouth, or is it falling short somewhere? Because if it's falling short somewhere, that's only going to be exposed more as it ages. To me, 16, I think the tannins are really well rounded. I think it hits all the pressure points in the mouth that I'm looking for. Like this is a complete wine. 15 to me, I think has more what I call like sort of prickly high tone aromatics that just blow out of the glass. But I think it's very, very fresh in its aromatics and its flavor profile. It's got that, because of that VA, it's got that almost like dill-like characteristic that you get sometimes from wines with VA, like that really like dill, tarragon, anise characteristic. And that will remain as the wine ages, but I don't think it's going to keep its weight and presence the way that 16 will. Like 16, it has that oomph, that stuffing to stay complete as it ages.
Oh my gosh, somebody did not receive their wine. Apologies.
Oh, really?
Appreciative that you're here. They will get there. Really sorry about that. This will be recorded. You'll be able to see it again And I'll be sending you something as an apology for that. Yeah, many apologies. Uh, well, I
Yeah, the
think that
71. I saw someone talked about the Ridge Islay. I've had that wine. It is absolutely spectacular.
so. It is. It's my unicorn wine. It's one of the wines that obviously changed my path, changed my winemaking career, changed everything about how I see Napa wine, especially. But that carried over into all my winemaking. And I have sourced one bottle, and for me, I'm holding on to it, and it's going to be the wine that I share with my kids one day, just for that reason of showing them what changed Dad's life into why he does the stupid stuff he does now.
Yeah, but you taste the tannin in this wine. These are not crazy tannins. These are tannins that you should expect from a Bordeaux varietal. I don't think any of these wines are overly tannic at all. I don't think
Yeah.
I think that if I were to give you these wines, you would never guess that they had stems on them. Is what I would say.
Well, I thank you, because I think that's a process in getting there to do that. And I think that there's an understanding with stems and what looking for that. I mean, there's plenty of vintages early on that I work with stems where you would get some stems out of them, and figuring out what that is. And I think the layman's way of avoiding that is to do 20%, 30%, and you can hide that very well, but have that side of some of the benefits of stems in it. And knowing when a wine wants to be able to use 100% whole cluster is another discussion. What are your thoughts on the 17 for longevity?
Well, what I'll say from the 16 and 17, when you just see it is, it tastes like the grapes were properly ripened. Like, it doesn't taste like you just picked early to try to make like a crunchy red wine. Like again, the intent to make a balanced wine meant that you weren't, none of these are cold sites. So you have to watch these, and you have to pull the trigger at the right time. You know what I mean? Like, so you're like, the difference of 2 days can make a dramatic difference in these wines. And what I say with this is, again, I'm going to say it again, but I love Cabernet Franc, but I'm always up in the air about the really, really green herbaceous Loire Valley Cabernet Francs that I think sometimes are actually probably picked too early, because I think you miss the mid on Cabernet Franc. To me, mid palate is incredibly important. It's what carries the wine. The other stuff is actually
let's not well, we can generalize, but there's also the examples in any area that just break down that entire discussion.
Sure.
But
yeah.
yes, yeah.
Like, well, because I think Cabernet Franc for me, without the mid and without the proper ripeness, it leans very heavily on those herbaceous components, and it doesn't get to its riper Garrigue-like presence. It becomes really, really like green bell pepper.
Yeah.
And I think this wine nails that savory side of the herbaceousness, which is what I like about Cabernet Franc. And if the question is about aging, all three of these wines will age incredibly well. I don't think that shouldn't even be a topic here. When you start to taste, these wines are not overly acidic; they have just enough acid, right? I also think that in a region like the Napa Valley, you always want to preserve acid, but you shouldn't have a wine that is tart, because that just would not be normal for a climate like this. There's ways to preserve enough acid. I think having tart acid in these wines would make them taste out of balance. Actually, the acid would be out of balance. To me, the acid's in its right place.
Well, I think that comes to a discussion. I think that's having a mature acid versus picking an immature acid, and that's another discussion unto itself. But I would like to have more mature acid than these wines have, if I can say it. So I think that they do have the acid in them is mature, and the whole cluster brings about a freshness of the acid, but yet at the same time, I would like to see the pH is lower, and yet not just pick an immature acid in order to get that. And so
I think that's very good.
Sarah Gold, a little bit about spacing between vines. I'm a huge proponent of high density, and our lack of that, and how doing that in the Napa Valley. It's not traditional over here. It's very, very difficult to do over here. I'm doing it out on the coast. I think that we should be doing more of it in Napa Valley and where we're at, but for the type of spacing that's typical in Napa, be it, I think, more 90s, early 2000s plantings that started to move toward more 6.5, 7 foot spacing between rows, or prior that was more kind of 8, 10, or 12 foot spacing between rows that kind of stemmed a little bit more from head trained, having, very, very widening for bigger tractors to get down, bigger equipment. I think that VSP allowed people to come back in a little bit tighter, to get a little bit closer, a little bit more potential shading on things that they needed. But personally, I think that either with a lot of Napa stuff, we have wider row spacing, and we're seeing this on Howell Mountain at our piece and a lot of Napa, but having that trellising that's allowing for a much bigger covering, a much more shading, much more allow for a little bit more crop and a longevity of season. That's not happening very often in very many places. We've gotten accustomed to this side of pushing things in earlier time frame, and I think that high density, when we're talking 4 foot rows and the stuff, it's tough because people don't do it because there's no equipment over here to manage that, to do that. And especially on hillsides, it becomes almost impossible. And unless you have the equipment over here to do it, and it's just not over here, and there's nobody to service it, nobody to help you do that economically. So you're getting into bigger tractors, into California size tractors that make you automatically push you to a row spacing and a size that you have to do in California in order to do something economically and efficiently. Anything else? Well, I will start just by saying thank you for taking the time and out of your busy schedule. You are an animal, how much you are pushing the wine world and how much you are just pushing everything out there and making your presence known. And I appreciate how much you're hustling and bringing a focus to not only the Napa Valley, but California, and to the fact that MSs, aren't all full of shit. And
no, a lot of them are. I mean, like every organization, there's a lot of bullshitters out there. No, and what I'll say is to me, this is fun, right? It's like when you get to work with people like the Lawrence family who pretty much say, hey, look, we trust you and we agree with what you're trying to do. Now just go out and do it. And you get like pretty much carte blanche, like hire who you want, people that you want to be around, make wines for the reasons that you believe in, and do things what you perceive as the right way. It's a luxury. And it's like, you want to work with people who, because the one thing, we could say is, and this may sound silly, is the reason why I didn't make a statement, but I changed my title in the company from CEO to CVO, which is Chief Visionary Officer. And it sounds really silly. I did it intentionally because I need people to understand that I don't make wines. I don't farm. I'm not actually physically doing anything. And I think often a lot of people who run companies, they often, they become figureheads and they take credit for everything. My job is to buy great pieces of land and take winemakers who are interested in farming and making wine there and let them oversee it and do it themselves. And, make sure that the vision for the wines we're making and what we want to do is there, and just like set them free. Because if I can't do that, there's no way I could accomplish everything that we need to accomplish. And it's really about, one comment here, which is great, it was the last thing was added, was this resurgence of youth that are interested in the old Napa. And what I'll say is that has always been here. Unfortunately, the ownership of a lot of these projects have never allowed that to come to fruition, to be utilized. In the youth of this valley, it's like these caged creatives that really want to make a certain style of wine, and they believe in a certain philosophy. And hopefully what we can do is be a safe haven for those people and say, hey, look, you come, you work with us and create and make wines like this that challenge people's perception and aren't afraid to do what we feel is the right thing, even though it may be dramatically different what someone else is doing. At some point, someone's got to do it, right? there was someone who made the first overly extracted 17% alcohol, overly oaked wine, and believed in that for some reason, right? So, I don't think it's too much for us to allow people like you and Nico and so forth. I mean, all the winemakers that we're working with to come out and do the right thing. And I think it's really exciting. I just have to deal with the fact that I'm a very impatient person. So I want to talk about a wine, and I want it aged and properly tasted in 2 weeks, not 6 years. So, to me, it's it sucks when we have to, it takes so long. We conceptualize these projects to actually get the wine presented to people. It takes a very long time, which is it's very difficult for me to digest that.
Well, thank you for pushing Napa Valley into the direction you are. And really quickly, what glass are you using? What glasses are you using there?
Oh, I grabbed some Zaltos, and the reason I grabbed the Burgundy is the Burgundy glass to me is great for aromatic varietals, which I knew these were going to be most Cabernet Sauvignons are not from the Napa Valley, are not made in this style, so you're not going to typically get that aromatic complexity like you would get this florality and so forth from these wines. You wouldn't typically get, but I knew you were going to get them here. So you need the same bowl shape that you use for Burgundy, you would use for these wines. So,
well, back to Burgundy again.
That's it. Delicious.
Thanks, you guys.
Can
Any
I
questions?
bomb you and say happy birthday?
Happy birthday!
Thanks, y'all.
I'm 28 years old.
Right, 28-year-old. Thank you guys so much. These will be recorded and posted a little bit later and sent to you guys. So if anything comes up or you have any questions, feel free to email me and or Carlton. We'll get it all answered back to you. And I appreciate everybody coming to this webinar. Thank you, Carlton.
Thank you.
Cheers, you guys. Bye.